Before the trip, I felt some familiarity with this city. Not a comprehensive knowledge, mind you, but a fair amount nonetheless. Some of it gleaned from mentions of great works of art, some from roaming through Assassin's Creed, and some from selecting Chianti, though most of the Chianti region actually lies just to the south. The city is of course intertwined with the legacy of the Medici family, Savonarola, Amerigo Vespucci, but it isn't just the Italians who left their mark here. Henry James penned the Portrait of a Lady, Elizabeth Barrett Browning composed her sonnets, and E.M. Forster wrote A Room with a View in this very city. Florence's influence extends to Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, George Handel, and countless others. To borrow an old slogan, when we say Renaissance, we mean Florence. Thus, when fate decreed that my next destination was the capital of Tuscany, I realized that dreams do indeed come true. Regrettably, the excursion could only commence in the afternoon, so much of my exploration took place after dusk. However, if you don't mind viewing the city in such an intimate twilight, then welcome to another brief tour, now of Florence's most fascinating sights. As always, the link to the map of my walk will be included in the video description, allowing you to plot your own route and experience Florence as you wish. Let's go! To avoid diving straight into the Renaissance, one of the most pivotal points in Florence's history, allow me to begin a bit earlier. Otherwise, you might get the impression that this explosion of Italian art and culture sprang forth from nowhere. Of course, you can skip this historical prologue if you prefer. Timestamps are provided in the description. Florence has officially existed since 59 BC, when the ubiquitous Romans established a settlement for their veterans. However, excavations reveal that the Etruscans utilized the ford across the Arno River near to the present-day Ponte Vecchio as far back as the 7th or even 6th centuries BC. According to one legend, the founding of the Roman village took place during the spring festival of Floralia, which supposedly gave the city its name. Another theory posits that the name derives from the Latin word fluentia, meaning stream, as the city lies near the confluence of the Mugnone and Arno rivers. Regardless of the name's origin, by 123 AD, the Romans had constructed a bridge across the Arno, and of course, Roman baths. Much like those in Trier. Do check the video for more on that. Around the same time, a port was built, initiating Florence's trading history, primarily along the river through Pisa, which would later lead to inevitable conflicts. In the 4th and 5th centuries, Christianity spread through Florence, supplanting the various Roman and Egyptian beliefs that had previously taken root. During the Middle Ages, the city suffered repeated assaults, first by the Goths and then the Lombards, until the Carolingians established their dominance and restored Florence, which had been nearly obliterated by these raids, to prominence. Under their rule, the city walls extended to the banks of the Arno, potentially saving Florence from Norman plunder in 825 when they rode up the Arno and attacked the neighboring city of Fiesole. Trade and relative peace facilitated Florence's development, and in 1059 the Florentine bishop Gerard of Burgundy ascended to the papacy as Nicholas II. By the 12th century, Florence had become a major trading hub, particularly in cloth, which was shipped down the Arno to the sea, causing friction with Pisa, the sole maritime outlet for Florentine goods. Florence's growth also alarmed neighboring republics like Lucca and Siena, which saw it as a competitor, leading to further conflicts. In the 13th century, Florence flourished through both commerce and force. It controlled the pilgrimage route of the Franks, and numerous Christian orders settled in the city, from the Augustinians to the Franciscans. This did not prevent Florence in 1252 from minting the first gold coin in Western Europe, the florin, which circulated widely through the Mediterranean and inspired the ducat. The florin became known as the guilder in Germany and the Netherlands, where it remained in use until replaced by the euro relatively recently. Similarly, the Polish zloty and even Hungarian forint also trace their origins to good old Florin. Even the British, with their ever-exotic system of measures, which I mentioned in the London and Greenwich video, minted florins until the mid-20th century, with their circulation continuing until 1993. The increase in religious attitudes led to spiritual and political strife, culminating in a protracted struggle between the Guelphs, who supported papal influence, and the Ghibellines, who favored secular power and the emperor. The religious tensions persisted until the end of the 15th century, finally subsiding with the execution of Savonarola. Simultaneously, Florence experienced a remarkable cultural renaissance, with luminaries such as Dante Alighieri and Giotto working there in the 13th and 14th centuries. Iconic structures like Santa Maria del Fiore and Palazzo Vecchio were erected. However, this cultural blossoming was marred by military setbacks in the early 14th century and a financial crisis in the mid-14th century, when Florentine creditors of King Edward III went bankrupt due to the outbreak of the Hundred Years' War. These events led to social unrest and repeated worker uprisings. Moreover, in 1348, a plague epidemic struck Florence. While it provided the backdrop for Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, the plague wrought immense devastation. Out of 120,000 inhabitants, between 25,000 and 70,000 perished. This catastrophe not only caused economic hardship, but also resulted in widespread hunger due to labor shortage in agriculture. Consequently, unlike Timisoara, Florence does not have a plague pillar. In the first half of the 15th century, Florence presented a rather fragile facade. On one side, splendid monuments and a flourishing culture. On the other, economic difficulties and military frailty. However, it's worth noting that in 1406, the Florentines finally triumphed over Pisa, concluding this conflict in their favor. By 1434, Florence was under the control of the Albizzi family. Officially through elections, but in reality through manipulated results and the exclusion of the undesirable candidates, Florence was effectively governed by members of one family, relying on the old aristocracy. The discontented, primarily the newly wealthy from lower social strata, were led by another family. Their supporters overthrew the Albizzi and ushered in the Medici family, who remained in power for 2 centuries and steered Florence towards the prosperity we associate with the city today. Under the Medici, and largely due to their patronage, the Renaissance reached its zenith, the High Renaissance, exemplified in the works of Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Tizian and Bramante. The works of Homer were first published during this period. Additionally, the Medici produced 4 popes and 2 queens of France. However, their rule was not without turbulence. In 1494, the Medici were expelled from Florence with great tumult, and the city was taken over by the radical Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, an ardent advocate of strict Christian precepts. During his rule, streets echoed with psalms instead of songs, sermons replaced festivities, and punishments were ostensibly severe. However, in practice, the courts often issued fines or banished people rather than enforcing harsher penalties. Espionage was rampant, but tightening control proved ineffective. In 1498, Savonarola was arrested and tortured, rendering his confessions meaningless. He was subsequently hanged in Piazza delle Signorie, and his body was burned at the stake. Despite his demise, Savonarola's teachings endured. One of his followers was Filippo Neri, whose oratorio I discussed in Alcalá de Henares. Nevertheless, in 1512, the Medici regained power in Florence. With a brief interruption from 1527 to 1530, the Medici descendants ruled until 1737. Towards the end of their reign, The Medici continued their patronage of the sciences and the arts, supporting figures like Galileo and overseeing the invention of the piano in 1700. Yet their dynasty eventually died out, marking the end of Florence's golden age. In more recent history, Florence faced significant events such as the occupation by Hitler's troops from 1943 to 44 and the miraculous preservation of the Ponte Vecchio. More on that later. The city also endured the catastrophic flood of 1966 when the Arno inundated Florence, a year marked by numerous tragedies including the Tashkent earthquake, which I discussed in a separate video. But enough about the sad stuff. Let's get back to the tour of Florence. Begin your adventure in a lesser-known spot, the Fortezza da Basso, a 16th century fortress. Built under Alessandro, the first Medici to hold the title of duke, it was designed for the city's defense and served as a refuge during civil unrest. Nowadays, it hosts exhibitions and concerts, and interestingly, near its outer walls, you'll find a bunch of the marginalized chaps. Quite a surprising sight in this otherwise charming city. Next, head to the Basilica of Santa Maria Novella near the station. This basilica offers a striking contrast depending on your viewpoint. On the station side, you'll see a stern Gothic brick facade, while the south side boasts classic Florentine inlay. The square to the south was once used for traditional palio races and events since the time of Cosimo I. It features a racetrack right where I stand now that circled wooden pillars, later rebuilt in stone and still standing today. The church itself is the first basilica in Florence, built in the 14th and the 15th centuries, and is renowned for the Botticelli's fresco above the entrance, which was only accidentally rediscovered in 1860. Such is Florence's wealth that it can afford to lose masterpieces for centuries. Inside, you'll find tombs by Rossellino, frescoes by Ghirlandaio, crucifixions by Brunelleschi and Giotto, and painting by Vasari. Most notably, it houses Masaccio's fresco The Trinity, which heralded the start of the Italian Renaissance in the 15th century. Visiting here is as rewarding as exploring the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, but one must know where to look. The Basilica is a museum complex of several buildings, deserving ample time if such treasures captivate you. For those less versed in medieval Italian art, consider that this is where the narrative of Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron begins, a captivating read about life during a plague. Alternatively, it's a setting for one of the Assassin's Creed missions. Different strokes for different folks, right? Crossing the Arno, make your way to the Brancacci Chapel, often dubbed the Sistine Chapel of the early Renaissance. Construction began in 1422, commissioned by Felice Brancacci, a silk merchant, diplomat and Medici rival. Due to his exile by the Medici, the chapel's completion was delayed for nearly 60 years until his return. The chapel is celebrated for its frescoes, depicting the life of Saint Peter, the patron saint of the Brancacci family. Several artists contributed, but Masaccio stands out, hailed by Giorgio Vasari as the finest artist of the early Renaissance, despite his untimely death at just 26. This modest-looking building, lacking funds for exterior decoration, houses 6 of Masaccio's frescoes, the masterpieces from which studied those who we consider the masters of the Italian Renaissance themselves: Botticelli, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and even Raphael. Don't worry, this video won't delve into a lecture on Renaissance art. It's better to experience it yourself, preferably with a bit of prior knowledge. Just remember that the Brancacci Chapel is part of the larger church of Santa Maria del Carmine, yet they operate as separate entities even with different opening times. Next on your tour is the Basilica of the Holy Spirit, or Santo Spirito. As is often the case in Florence, its exterior might not be particularly striking, despite being constructed in the 15th century based on the design of Brunelleschi. Unfortunately, Brunelleschi passed away before its completion, so the church was finished posthumously but remains true to his original vision. Here you will find the purest example of early Renaissance architecture, notably devoid of any inlays. The true treasures of the basilica lie within. For instance, Filippino Lippi's Madonna with Child and Saints, whose works you might have seen in the Brancacci Chapel and the Strozzi Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria Novella. Additionally, Michelangelo's Crucifixion, created at the age of just 17 in 1492, is housed here. Michelangelo crafted this piece in gratitude to the abbot, who provided him with a space to study anatomy through dissection. Typical of Florence, this masterpiece was lost for 470 years before being rediscovered in 1962. Continuing your journey, you will reach the most grand and famous palace in Florence, home to the city's most renowned ruling family. Yes, we are talking about the Palazzo Pitti. There is also the Palazzo Medici, which is simply an appearance and located closer to the city center. However, Palazzo Pitti, situated across the Arno from the city center, was built in the latter half of the 15th century by banker Luca Pitti, who aimed to surpass the Medici family palace. According to local legend, the courtyard of Palazzo Pitti was designed to accommodate the entire Palazzo Strozzi, another opulent Florentine family estate, with its windows intended to be larger than the doors of the Palazzo Medici. Another tale suggests that even those expelled from Florence, including criminals, could find refuge here, provided they contributed to the palace's construction. The Pitti family, however, could not complete the construction. By 1464, Luca Pitti faced financial troubles, and although the family had lived here since 1462, the palace was sold to the Medici family in 1549. The Medicis resided here until their decline in 1737, and it was here where the last Medici, Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, signed the so-called family Pact, bequeathing the family's wealth to the state, with the condition that their masterpieces remain in Florence. It was also here in 1600 that the wedding of King Henry IV of France and Maria de' Medici took place, albeit with the king represented by proxy. In the early 19th century, the palace became the residence of Napoleon Bonaparte, and later, after the unification of Italy, of Victor Emmanuel II. In 1919, the palace was transferred to the state, and 5 galleries and a museum were established here. As is often the case in Florence, in 2005 several forgotten 18th century bathrooms were unexpectedly discovered in the palace. The museum and galleries house priceless collections from the Medici collection and their successors, the Dukes of Lorraine. Here you'll find 11 paintings by Raphael, works by Titian, Tintoretto, Giorgione, Rubens, Van Dyck, Caravaggio, Murillo, and Florentine manierists such as Pontormo, Fra Bartolomeo, and Andrea del Sarto. The exterior of the palace can be slightly misleading. The stones on the facade are not what the palace was constructed from. They are merely cladding. This is evident upon close inspection. According to legend, Luca Pitti ordered the largest solid stone in Florence to be mounted here to demonstrate his importance, and a tiny stone beside it probably to show the insignificance of all others. Under each window is a Florentine lion with a Medici crown, which supposedly existed but is now lost. True to Florence's form, perhaps in a few hundred years it will be rediscovered. Under the leftmost window you'll find a notable feature. It's not a bathtub, but a non-functioning fountain. The Medici installed it here to maintain the facade's aesthetic while providing residents with clean water, as the Arno River, polluted by dye factories, was far from clean, especially during the hot summers. Then we head down to the river, and into what seems like a nondescript alley. But as it often happens in Florence, this inconspicuous passage suddenly reveals the famous Ponte Vecchio. Past the Manelli Tower, dating back to 1345, you reach the old bridge itself. Initially, the Romans built it at the narrowest part of the river, but it was repeatedly washed away by floods until it finally gained its current form in 1345. Originally, the bridge housed butchers' shops, which found it very convenient to dispose of waste directly into the river below. Due to the bustling trade, many ordinary residents frequented the area. So in 1565, to avoid mingling with the common folk, Cosimo I de' Medici commissioned architect Giorgio Vasari to construct the so-called Vasari corridor above the shops. This enclosed passage allowed the ruler to walk freely and unnoticed from the Palazzo Vecchio to the Palazzo Pitti. Today, the corridor houses an art gallery featuring works by Raphael, Vasari himself, Rubens and Velázquez, along with the unrestored paintings damaged during the 1993 terrorist attack. Initially, the corridor had only small round windows. However, by Mussolini's order, they were expanded into large rectangular windows in anticipation of Hitler's visit. What a beautiful thing they spoiled! Speaking of the war, the Ponte Vecchio is the only bridge in Florence to survive World War II. This was thanks to the German consul in Florence, Gerhard Wolff. Not only did he save Jews during the Holocaust and prevent artworks from being sent to Germany, but he also convinced the generals not to destroy the bridge in 1944. Over time, the butcher's shops were replaced by more refined establishments and housing. Yes, people used to live on bridges back then, and it seems some still do. Jewelers' shops now occupy the space, and at some time they even included the workshop of the famed Benvenuto Cellini. His bust stands on the bridge, supposedly looking towards the site of his workshop. Almost directly opposite the Ponte Vecchio is perhaps the most famous museum in Florence, the Uffizi Gallery. Initially, I thought Uffizi was an Italian surname, akin to Pitti or Strozzi, but it simply means officers. Cosimo I commissioned Vasari to design this building as an administrative hub for Florence, requiring significant space that incorporated many ancient buildings. For instance, the church of San Pier Scheraggio was absorbed into the complex, with its arches and columns still visible from the outside and its altar becoming one of the gallery's halls. Discussing the museum in detail would be a disservice to its grandeur, and shaky video clips wouldn't do justice to the experience. For just 25 euros, or maybe just 2 if you're lucky, you can marvel at masterpieces by Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Verrocchio, Botticelli, Tizian and many more, which any cultured person has seen countless times in reproductions. From here, you can either head back to the left bank of the Arno if you still have the energy and daylight, or pause until the next day. Trust me, these views are well worth the wait. If you decide to continue, make sure not to miss an unassuming house along the way. This was the home of one of the pioneers of modern science and knowledge, Galileo Galilei, in the early 17th century. The house itself might not be very remarkable, but it housed a man whose understanding far surpassed that of many of my contemporaries. Here you can take a breath, because the next climb is definitely one to finish. And then you will find yourself in a completely unusual place for Florence, which we are used to seeing in the form of churches, architectural monuments and works of art. This is Fort Belvedere, the second defensive structure of Florence, built at the very end of the 16th century by order of Ferdinand I de' Medici. The fort served several purposes. First, it defended the city from a commanding height. Second, it protected this strategic location, the weakest point in Florence's medieval defenses. Third, it covered the Palazzo Pitti below and the Medici family who resided there. Fourth, it housed a few hundred soldiers in its barracks, just in case. And fifth, since we just came from Galileo's house, yes, Galileo himself used the fort for astronomical observations. The Vasari corridor reaches all the way to the fort, allowing easy access from the city. The fort also contains a treasury with traps at the entrance and numerous underground passages beneath bobbly gardens leading to Palazzo Pitti. In times of trouble, the Medici had a secure place to retreat. Today, there are no historical artifacts here. Instead, it serves as a wedding venue. Kardashian and Kanye West reportedly tied the knot here, and hosts exhibitions and concerts. To be honest, I checked out the current exhibition, but frankly, it didn't leave much of an impression. No offense, but I'm more captivated by the Italian Renaissance than by installations whose meanings are explained in lengthy wall posters. The clock tower mechanism might be interesting, though I'm not certain if it's part of the exhibition. In my opinion, Fort Belvedere's primary appeal lies in its stunning views of Florence below. That alone makes it worth visiting before dark. Luckily, this is the highest point of the entire walk. If you've already climbed here, it will be easier from now on. You'll continue along the ancient fortress wall. I walked in the opposite direction though, towards ancient towers and gates, some standing since the 16th century. As it often is the case, parts of the walls were destroyed as the city expanded and the walls got in the way. In some places, city gates remain, such as the San Miniato gate. Compared to the general Florentine backdrop, it may not seem very remarkable, but it's surrounded by many cafes, making it a good spot for a quick snack. Some towers now stand alone without any surrounding walls. Some are being restored while others simply stand as solitary structures. For instance, the three-tiered San Niccolò gate once served as a city gate and now functions as an observation deck. The San Niccolò Dam, with its now unused passage to the other bank, still crosses the Arno from the tower. The dam once blocked the waterway upstream while collecting water to power presses in the basement of the Torre della Zecca on the opposite bank. This tower, which never had a through passage, was once a mint, where the famous florins began to be minted. As usual, in the evening, or let's call it romantically mysterious twilight, another legendary Florentine church appears. The largest Franciscan church in the world, famous primarily for Giotto's frescoes and the tombs or cenotaphs of great Italians and others. Santa Croce, the Church of the Holy Cross. According to another legend, the church was founded by Francis of Assisi himself. At least it was already known in 1229 that the church standing here was dedicated to him. This building was consecrated only in 1442, and as usual, it was rebuilt more than once. But over all this time, the church has collected frescoes, tombs and sculptures by Giotto, Arcanghi, Cimabue and many others under its roof. In addition to frescoes and paintings, Santa Croce also houses an extensive pantheon. Some tombs are real, like those of Galileo, with figures around him being the geometry and astronomy. Gioacchino Rossini, Michelangelo, with painting, architecture and sculpture. Niccolò Machiavelli with an allegory of diplomacy above him, and Guglielmo Marconi with a rather simple plaque. In some cases, such as Enrico Fermi, there's just a memorial plaque. Dante only has a cenotaph here. He's buried in Ravenna and the local authorities do not extradite him to Florence. However, in front of the basilica, there's a full-fledged monument. The biggest surprise for me was the burial of Mikhail Aginsky. On the other hand, well, why not? In general, Florence is amazing for its prospects. Behind an inconspicuous passage, one discovers cultural admiration, and then around the turn, suddenly, a whole garland of places, masterpieces and sculptures flowing into each other, ringing and scattering emotions. Do you recognize this place? This is Piazza delle Signorie, and for starters, Palazzo Vecchio, the Old Palace, built from 1299 to 1314. It wasn't always called old. Initially, it was quite the opposite, the New Palace, where after construction the city council met, and the Old Palace was the Bargello where the council met before that. In the 15th century, the rulers of the city decided to call themselves Signori, and the building itself began to be called Palazzo delle Signorie, thus giving the name to the square in front of the palace. In 1540, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo I, moved here, and the building was renamed Palazzo Ducale. In 1565, the Duke moved his residence to Palazzo Pitti, which I have already shown, and this building became known as the Old Palace. It retains this name to this day, and again serves as the town hall. In its lifetime, the palace has seen both good and bad. Conspirators were hanged from its windows, and Savonarola was executed in front of it, but it also displayed Donatello's Judith and Holofernes composition, replaced in 1504 by Michelangelo's David. While David was replaced by a copy in 1910, the statue of Hercules and Cacus by Baccio Bardinelli is the original, standing here since 1530. However, it frankly pales in comparison to David opposite to it. In front of the palace, there's a large covered area, the so-called Loggia dei Lanzi, also known as Loggia delle Signorie or Loggia di Arcagna. Originally built for public meetings and celebrations, it later became a kind of an open-air museum. Here, the sculptures are publicly available, from antique pieces like the Girls and the Pasquino group to works from the 16th century, such as the Rape of the Sabine Women and Hercules and Nessus, and even the relatively modern Rape of Polyxena. But the main attraction is of course Cellini's original Perseus. You could talk about him for hours, about the first so-called drowned statue, the history of its creation, and about Cellini himself. Sometimes, reading about Florence, I would shudder internally when authors spoke so casually about what is considered real masterpieces. David, Perseus, and then I sat down on the steps of the Lanzi Loggia and realized that perhaps I'm just lucky that all the museums and the cathedrals are already closed. All I can do is walk at my own pace, look around, sometimes even missing something, but absorbing the very spirit of this city. After all, it's not obligatory to tick off seeing the birth of Venus and take a photograph with David. It's that the Ponte Vecchio really becomes not a landmark but a way home, and the Duomo a familiar city church. Yes, the square also hosts the pompous Fountain of Neptune, created for Francesco I the Medici wedding in 1570. Yes, Cosimo I by Giambologna is sitting next to him on a horse, dating back to the very end of the 16th century. But this area is so much more than just the sum of all these priceless artifacts. Having philosophized enough, I moved on. This unusual rectangular building is also a church. Rather, this building underwent several changes and eventually became a church. Here were gardens, orti, and nearby was the Church of St. Michael. That is, these were the gardens of St. Michael, Orti San Michele, which later shortened to Orsanmichele. The ancient church was demolished and a grain storage facility was built at the end of the 13th century. That is why it has such a strange shape for a church. The grain itself was stored on the first floor, then the building was two-story, and the bread was sold on the ground floor. Hence the huge openings there. At the beginning of the 14th century, the building burned down and was rebuilt in 1337, adding one floor and closing the openings on the lower floor, making it a church. In 1348, to save the city from the plague, donations were made that exceeded the annual budget of the entire Florence. With this money, Andrea Arcagna, to whom the Loggia Lanzi was once attributed, made a so-called tabernacle for the church. In fact, a reliquary made of marble, which can be seen to this day. On the outside, at the beginning of the 15th century, the church was decorated with statues representing the heavenly patrons of local guilds. St. Peter by Brunelleschi from the Butchers Guild, St. George, this time finally without a dragon, by Donatello from the Guild of Gunsmiths, St. John by Montelupo from the Guild of Silk Merchants, John the Baptist by Ghiberti from the Guild of Clothing and Fabric Merchants, as well as the Madonna with a Rose. This, by the way, is a copy like many others. The original statues are either inside the church or in the Bargello Museum. And a group of the so-called four-crowned martyrs, covers who, according to legend, refused to portray pagan gods. All in all, there are 14 statues there, and I'll leave you the opportunity to discover and examine the rest for yourself. Meanwhile, you can pass through the Republic Square, where it turns out the carousel stands all year round, not just on holidays. From there, you can go to Piazza San Giovanni and the Duomo to see probably the most famous buildings in Florence: the Baptistery of San Giovanni, Giotto's Campanile, and the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore with Brunelleschi's Dome. Let's take it in order. The oldest building is the Baptistery. It's the octagonal building completed in 1129. Research has shown that before this, there was another baptistery building here for about 4 or 5 centuries, and according to another urban legend, it in turn stood on the site of the Roman temple of the god Mars. But it seems that this is still a legend. Be that as it may, the real fact is that the infants of Florence were baptized here until the 19th century. This includes almost everyone we have already mentioned today: the members of the Medici family, Brunelleschi, Boccaccio, Dante, Amerigo Vespucci, even it seems the Mona Lisa. You can imagine who was brought here to be baptized during all this time. In the mid-12th century, the building took on its modern appearance, after it was faced with 3 types of marble. This is the same inlay style that I mentioned at the very beginning of the video. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the incredible bronze doors of the baptistery were made, depicting scenes from the Old and New Testaments and the life of John the Baptist. By the way, there are only 3 doors, because historically the baptistery was adjacent to the bishop's palace on the 4th side. In the 19th century, the area was expanded and it became free on all sides, which caused indignation among architects, but who listened to them? There is another way to see the Eastern Gate, which impressed Michelangelo so much that he recognized it as suitable for the Gate of Heaven. Surprisingly, a copy of them with minor changes has been installed at the northern entrance to the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg since the 19th century. And this is not the only link to Russia around. The Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore and the bell tower next to it were built later than the baptistery. The cathedral was first founded in 1296, and 3 years later construction of the tower began. It is named after Giotto, who made its first general design, although the foundation was laid by the architect of the neighboring cathedral, Arnolfo di Cambio. Giotto, however, did not live long enough to complete the tower, and it was finalized by Andrea Pisano and Francesca Talenti. All the same architects, plus of course Filippo Brunelleschi, worked on the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. It was meant to demonstrate the power of Florence and simultaneously put to shame the temples of its main rivals, Siena and Pisa. The resulting temple became the second largest after St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. In this video, I will not delve into the history of the creation of the cathedral. I will only say that it was built on the same site that the previously existing church of Santa Reparata, which is why the cathedral was called Santa Reparata for a long time, and 2 of its architects, Brunelleschi and Giotto, are buried in it. The cathedral has a clock that has been running since 1443, in the opposite direction by the way, and a lot of frescoes, including the Divine Comedy illuminates Florence, depicting Dante Alighieri with an open book in his hands against the backdrop of medieval Florence. It's funny that the fresco shows the cathedral itself with a dome, but with a cladding not yet completed. There is a little known story about it. At the end of the 16th century, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Francesco I, ordered the facade to be rebuilt. Then the projects were changed a few times, but in the end, by 1887, the facade, although it was built, stood without cladding. It was then that it was decorated in the same inlay style as we see it now. And the money for this work was given by none other than Pavel Demidov, one of the last members of this Russian family of manufacturers, who became an honorary citizen of Florence. The main engineering masterpiece of the cathedral is, of course, the dome. Its construction needs to be explained on the spot, so now I'll just say that it's the second largest dome in Italy, only a meter smaller than the dome of the Pantheon in Rome. However, the biggest problem was not its size, but the impossibility of placing scaffolding at such a height, delivering materials there, laying them in a strict order and with a given curvature. These problems were solved by Brunelleschi, with the help of machines he invented, which may have impressed the young Da Vinci who worked in the workshop where they made the lantern crowning the dome. Behind the cathedral, there's a museum of artworks of the cathedral, where the original models and statues have been moved, which in the cathedral itself have been replaced in some places by copies. Florence, a city overflowing with cultural heritage, presents itself as an open-air museum where history and art permeate every corner. For example, this 16th century church of San Giovanni degli Scolopi might be an attraction elsewhere, but is considered rather unremarkable by Florentine standards. But just behind it stands the Basilica of San Lorenzo, a testament to Florence's rich and intricate past. San Lorenzo, despite its unassuming, unfinished facade, which is so surprising given its role, holds a significant place in Florentine history. The church dates back to the late 4th century, was first rebuilt in the 11th century and then underwent a major reconstruction in the 15th century, under the design of Filippo Brunelleschi. Indeed, can't you see Brunelleschi's architectural genius here? Since 1429, San Lorenzo has served as the burial place for the Medici family, attracting numerous Renaissance masterpieces within its walls. The basilica houses tombstones and sarcophagi by Verrocchio and Michelangelo and a pulpit by Donatello. The Medici Chapel, specifically the Chapel of the Princes, was intended to hold the Holy Sepulchre from Jerusalem, although this plan never came to fruition, as you may already know. In a twist of fate that seems almost impossible, but fully following Florentine tradition to lose invaluable masterpieces, a corridor adorned with Michelangelo's drawings was lost for centuries and only rediscovered in 1976. How does one lose something so precious? This astonishing oversight just adds to the city's air of mystery and endless surprises. All in all, visiting Florence is like stepping into a unique realm, one where the past and present intertwine seamlessly. Its charm lies not only in its renowned museums and galleries, but also in the everyday experience of walking through streets lined with works by the great masters of the Italian Renaissance. Here, you can savor a cup of coffee while sitting on centuries-old steps, watching life unfold amidst some of the world's greatest art. Is it worth visiting Florence? It is, without any doubts it is, but mind you, Florence demands more than just a checklist approach to tourism. In my opinion, it requires a slower, more immersive experience to truly appreciate its essence. I can only confirm what E.M. Forster eloquently wrote in A Room with a View.
A valuable hour may slip away, and the traveler who has gone to Florence to study the tactile valors of Giotto or the corruption of the papacy may return remembering nothing but the blue sky and the men and women who live under it. One doesn't come to Florence for niceness. One comes for life. Buongiorno, buongiorno! They bath in the streets in the early spring sunshine. What more could one want?